Jerry had always been the kind of man who kept to himself. He maintained his property, paid his taxes, minding his own business. The neighborhood had been peaceful when he first moved in, 5 years ago, filled with families who, like him, just wanted to enjoy their homes, without unnecessary interference. But everything changed when Karen arrived. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the newly formed Homeowners Association, a woman who saw every untrimmed hedge, every slightly faded mailbox, as a personal insult. She had moved into the largest house on the street, one that sat directly across from Jerry's. Within weeks of her arrival, she had taken over the Homeowner Association, turning it into a bureaucratic nightmare for every resident. Jerry had never been involved in community politics. He had specifically chosen this neighborhood because it had no HOA when he moved in. He had confirmed it, read every document, ensuring he wouldn't have to deal with pointless regulations. But Karen didn't care about what had existed before her. She was determined to bring order, her version of order, and she would do whatever was necessary to enforce it. The first notice arrived early one morning, folded neatly in an envelope placed on his door. It was written in formal language, informing him that all residents were now expected to comply with the new HOA guidelines, including lawn maintenance standards, approved paint colors, and restrictions on visible trash cans. Jerry had laughed at the absurdity of it, tossing the letter in the trash. He wasn't part of the HOA. He didn't have to follow their rules. But Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. A second letter came, then a third, each one more aggressive than the last, stating that refusal to comply would result in fines, that his property would be subject to inspection, that legal action could be taken if necessary. Jerry ignored them all, but ignoring Karen only made her more persistent. One evening, he noticed her standing outside his house, clipboard in hand, writing something down. He stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. "Can I help you?" She barely glanced up. "Just making some notes," she said, her tone clipped. "Official." Jerry frowned. "Notes on what?" She sighed, as if he was being difficult. "HOA compliance. Routine inspections. Nothing to worry about if your property is up to standard." Jerry's jaw clenched. "I'm not in the HOA. I don't need to be up to any standard." Karen looked at him then, a small, cold smile appearing on her lips. "That's where you're mistaken. This community has agreed to new regulations. Everyone must follow them." He could hear the certainty in her voice. She thought she had already won. Jerry exhaled slowly, already knowing this was just the beginning. He had dealt with difficult people before, but Karen was on another level. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was creating them, bending the neighborhood to her will. And she had decided that he was going to follow along, whether he liked it or not. The next morning, another notice was taped to his door. This one was different, bolder, less like a friendly reminder, more like a warning. It listed fines, outrageous amounts for supposed violations, overgrown grass, improper trash placement, an unapproved mailbox. Jerry scoffed. His lawn was perfectly maintained. His trash cans were where they had always been. His mailbox was the same one that had stood there for years. The accusations were ridiculous, completely fabricated, and he knew exactly who was behind them. He crumpled the paper, tossing it aside. But Karen wasn't done yet. Later that afternoon, as he was working in his garage, he heard a knock, a sharp, deliberate sound. He wiped his hands, walking over to open the door. And there she was, standing with two other board members, looking as smug as ever. "Jerry," she began, her tone dripping with forced politeness, "I assume you've seen the notice." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Yeah, I saw it, and I also saw that it's complete nonsense." Karen's expression didn't falter. "I assure you, these violations are quite real. And as a member of this community, you are expected to comply with our guidelines." Jerry arched a brow. "I'm not in the HOA." Her smile barely wavered, but her eyes gleamed with something close to amusement. "Oh, but you are. You see, when the HOA was officially formed last year, all properties within the community were automatically included. That means you're under our jurisdiction now." Jerry felt his patience thinning. "I have legal documents that say otherwise." She tilted her head. "Then you shouldn't have any problem proving it." But until then, you'll need to start making the necessary adjustments. The board will be conducting inspections regularly. Jerry clenched his jaw. He could argue with her all day, but he knew her type. She thrived on pushing people until they gave up. That was her game. She counted on people getting frustrated, giving in, letting her win. But Jerry wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to be bullied. He wasn't going to fold. Instead, he smiled. "Sure, Karen. Let me get my lawyer on the phone. We can go over the legal status of my property right now." Karen's smile flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Without another word, she turned on her heel, marching down his driveway, the board members trailing behind her. Jerry watched them go, knowing this wasn't over. Not even close. By the next week, the harassment had escalated. Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, she was doubling her efforts. Jerry started receiving letters almost daily, each one citing a new violation, each one demanding immediate correction. The fines were getting more absurd. Hundreds of dollars for things as trivial as leaving his garden hose uncoiled, for having a porch light that wasn't an HOA-approved model, for parking his truck in his own driveway instead of inside the garage. He ignored them, but Karen wasn't relying on just paperwork anymore. She had moved on to direct confrontation. One evening, as Jerry was bringing his groceries inside, he saw her standing at the edge of his driveway, clipboard in hand, watching, writing, taking notes like she was documenting some grand criminal act. He sighed, deciding to confront her head-on. "Problem, Karen." She barely glanced up. "Just making sure everything is up to standard," she said, her tone crisp. "Official. You understand, of course." Jerry folded his arms. "I understand that you're wasting your time. And mine. I don't answer to the HOA. You don't have any authority here." Karen smiled. A slow, knowing smile. "You keep saying that, but you'll find that refusing to cooperate will only make things more difficult for you." Jerry arched a brow. "That a threat?" She tilted her head slightly. "Just a simple observation. There are rules for a reason, and people who refuse to follow them tend to create unnecessary conflict." Jerry exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for this." He turned, walking back toward his house. But her voice stopped him. "Oh, by the way," she said, her tone too casual, "the board has scheduled another inspection of your property. Tomorrow morning. Just routine. Nothing to worry about." Jerry clenched his jaw. "Routine, huh?" Without another word, he went inside, closing the door behind him. He had been patient. He had tried ignoring her. But it was clear now. That wasn't going to work. Karen wasn't just testing his limits. She was trying to break him, make him give up, make him give in. But that wasn't going to happen. The next morning, before the so-called inspection could begin, Jerry made a call to his lawyer. It was time to put an end to this nonsense. The lawyer wasted no time reviewing Jerry's case. After looking through his property records, legal documents, and the HOA's supposed authority, he confirmed what Jerry already knew. He was not part of the HOA. He had never signed any agreement. His property was legally exempt, which meant everything Karen was doing, every fine, every notice, every so-called inspection, was completely baseless. Jerry felt a sense of relief. But he also knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Karen had spent too much time and effort trying to force him under her control. She wasn't going to back down just because he had proof on his side. And sure enough, the next morning, another notice appeared on his door. This one was different, more official-looking. It claimed that due to repeated non-compliance, further action was being considered, including potential legal proceedings. Jerry shook his head. The sheer audacity of it. He had the law on his side, and yet, Karen was still trying to intimidate him. He had had enough. He scanned the document, highlighting every false claim, every blatant overreach. Then he sent a formal response through his lawyer, a cease and desist letter, stating in clear terms that Karen and the HOA had no legal authority over his property, and that any further harassment would result in legal action against them. The response came faster than expected. Karen showed up at his house that evening. Alone this time, no clipboard, no board members, just her, standing on his porch with that same smug expression. Jerry opened the door, not inviting her in. "Can I help you?" She smiled, a tight, forced smile. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jerry crossed his arms. Oh, I think everything is very clear. I don't answer to the HOA. You have no legal authority over my property. So whatever power trip you're on, it ends now. Karen's smile faltered, just for a second. Then she straightened. The HOA exists to maintain order, Jerry. You may think you're exempt, but the community as a whole expects compliance. Jerry exhaled sharply. Not my problem. I don't answer to you. And if you keep this up, you'll be answering to my lawyer. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned, walking away without another word. Jerry watched her go, knowing this wasn't the last he'd hear from her. But at least now, the battle lines had been drawn. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Karen wasn't the type to just walk away. Jerry knew that. He had called her bluff, put her on notice. But people like her didn't take losing lightly. And he was right, because just as he was starting to think she had given up, the next wave of harassment began. This time, it wasn't just notices on his door. It was something more, something personal. It started with little things. A letter from the city claiming there had been an anonymous complaint about the condition of his lawn. Then another, about a supposed noise violation. Then one about improper storage of waste bins. Jerry wasn't stupid. He knew exactly where these complaints were coming from. Karen had shifted tactics. If she couldn't use the HOA to force his compliance, she would try using the city instead. He called the municipal office, spoke to the inspectors. None of them had actually come to his property yet. They were just responding to anonymous reports, meaning there was no actual evidence of any violations. Jerry made sure to clarify that. He wasn't about to let Karen use bureaucracy as a weapon. And for a little while, it seemed to work. The complaints stopped. But Karen wasn't done. A few nights later, Jerry was woken up by the sound of footsteps near his driveway. He sat up, eyes narrowing as he reached for his phone, checking the security cameras he had installed. And there she was, Karen, standing near his mailbox, a flashlight in hand, looking through his property like she had every right to be there. Jerry clenched his jaw. That was it. He got out of bed, moving quickly but quietly toward the door. He threw it open, stepping outside. Karen froze. Jerry stared at her, his voice low. Even, are you seriously trespassing on my property? Karen straightened, regaining some of her usual arrogance. Just making sure everything is up to code, she said. Jerry exhaled sharply, his patience worn thin. You're not law enforcement. You're not the city. And you sure as hell are my landlord. Get off my property. Now. She didn't move, her lips pressing into a thin line. You're being unreasonable, Jerry. You should want to keep the neighborhood looking nice. Jerry stepped forward, his voice dropping lower. You have 10 seconds before I call the cops. Karen's eyes flickered. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue. But then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Jerry stood there, watching, making sure she was gone. Then he checked the cameras again, saving the footage. This time, he wasn't just going to let it slide. This time, she had crossed the line. The next morning, Jerry took the footage straight to the police. He wasn't the type to involve law enforcement over petty disputes. But this wasn't petty anymore. Karen had stepped onto his property in the middle of the night. Snooping, trespassing, and who knew what else she had planned. The officer at the front desk listened as Jerry explained the situation. Then he watched the footage, his expression unreadable. This woman, Jerry said, pointing at the screen, she's been harassing me for weeks. And now she's stepping onto my property without permission. I want to file a report. The officer exhaled slowly, nodding. Yeah, that's definitely trespassing. He typed something into his system, took down Jerry's statement. You want to press charges? Jerry thought about it. He wanted to, but he also knew Karen was slippery. If he took this to court, she would twist it, find some way to make herself look like the victim. Not yet, he said, but I want it on record. If this escalates, I'll take the next step. The officer nodded again. Fair enough. We'll keep this on file. And if she does anything else, let us know. Jerry left the station feeling a little better. But he wasn't naive. He knew Karen wouldn't stop just because she had been reported. If anything, she would see it as a challenge. And he was right. Because later that afternoon, another letter appeared on his door. This time, it wasn't from the HOA or the city. It was from a law office, a formal cease and desist letter, accusing him of harassment, of targeting Karen unfairly, of making false accusations against her. Jerry laughed. The irony was almost impressive. She had been harassing him for weeks. And now, because he had finally stood up to her, she was playing the victim. Classic. But he wasn't worried. He had evidence. He had footage. He had proof that she was the one who had crossed the line. He called his lawyer, forwarded the letter. His lawyer barely skimmed it before chuckling. "Looks like she's panicking," he said. "This has no legal standing. She's just trying to intimidate you." Jerry nodded. "Figured as much. What do we do?" His lawyer leaned back in his chair. "We do nothing. Let her waste her money on threats that mean nothing. She wants a fight, but she doesn't have a case. You, on the other hand, do." Jerry exhaled. He didn't like waiting. He preferred taking action. But he trusted his lawyer. And he knew that, in the end, Karen's tactics were only making her look worse. She thought she was backing him into a corner. But all she was really doing was digging her own grave. Days passed, and Karen remained unusually quiet. Too quiet. Jerry knew better than to think she had given up. She wasn't the type. She thrived on control, on getting her way, and silence wasn't her style. So when a full week went by without a single letter, notice, or fake violation, he knew she was planning something. And sure enough, one evening, as he was returning home, he saw it. A small group of people gathered in Karen's front yard. Board members, a few neighbors, some familiar faces, some he had never seen before. And Karen, standing in the center, talking, gesturing, rallying them like some kind of leader preparing for battle. Jerry parked his truck, watching from a distance. He couldn't hear what she was saying, but he didn't need to. He already knew. She was spinning a new narrative, twisting the truth, painting herself as the victim, and him as the villain, the disruptive neighbor, the man who refused to follow rules, who was tearing apart their precious community with his defiance. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. The woman was relentless. That night, another letter appeared on his door. This time, it wasn't a violation notice or a legal threat. It was an invitation, a mandatory HOA meeting, scheduled for the end of the week. The topic: community concerns and necessary action against repeated noncompliance. Jerry laughed dryly. She wanted a public spectacle, a show, a stage where she could put him on trial in front of everyone. He tossed the letter on his counter, knowing exactly what she was doing, and deciding right then and there that he wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let her control the narrative. If she wanted a meeting, if she wanted to turn this into a battle of perception, then fine. He would be there, but he wouldn't be walking in unprepared. The next morning, Jerry started gathering his own support, talking to neighbors, the ones Karen hadn't completely brainwashed, the ones who had been on the receiving end of her harassment too, the ones who had been too afraid to push back. Until now, he pulled out every piece of evidence, every letter, every fake fine, every absurd claim. He made copies. He was ready. The night of the meeting arrived, and Jerry walked in prepared. He wasn't there to argue. He wasn't there to defend himself. He was there to expose Karen, to let her own actions speak for themselves. The room was packed. More people than he had expected. Some looking curious, others looking uneasy. And Karen, sitting at the front like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, that smug expression never wavering, as if she had already won. The meeting began. Karen stood, clearing her throat. "Thank you all for coming. As most of you know, we have had ongoing issues with a certain resident, someone who refuses to follow the guidelines that keep our community safe and beautiful." Jerry leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, letting her talk, letting her dig her own hole. She went on, listing every supposed violation, every excuse she had fabricated, painting herself as the protector of the neighborhood, and him as the reckless outsider who refused to cooperate. And when she finally finished, when she turned to him with that expectant look, waiting for him to lash out, to argue, to prove her right, he smiled. Then he pulled out his stack of papers. "Thank you, Karen," he said calmly. "Now let's talk about facts." He started laying everything out: the false violations, the harassment, the late-night trespassing, the security footage, the police report. He didn't just speak. He showed evidence, document after document, letting the room see exactly what had been happening, letting them see Karen for what she was. And as he spoke, he saw the shift, the murmurs, the exchanged glances. The board members who had once blindly supported Karen, now looking uncomfortable, doubting, realizing. And then he dropped the final piece, a formal petition, signed by several residents, demanding an official review of Karen's position on the HOA board. The room went silent. Karen's face went pale. For the first time since this started, she had nothing to say. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. For years, they had followed Karen's lead, letting her run things unchecked. But now, faced with undeniable proof of her misconduct, they couldn't just brush it aside. One of them cleared his throat, shuffling some papers. "This is, a serious matter," he said hesitantly. "We will need to conduct a review, a formal review." Karen shot up from her seat, her face red with anger. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "This man has been nothing but a disruption to this community. And now you're going to entertain his baseless accusations." Jerry stayed silent, watching, letting her unravel. She turned to the room, looking for support, but the people who had once nodded along with her now looked away, avoiding her gaze. She was losing them, and she knew it. The board member coughed again, adjusting his glasses. "We will have to go over the evidence, Karen," he said carefully. "The petition is valid, and the accusations brought forward are substantial." Karen's hands clenched into fists. "This is my community," she hissed. "I built this." The board member shifted uncomfortably. "We will discuss this further at our next meeting. Until then, this discussion is closed." The meeting was adjourned. People began filing out, whispers filling the room. Karen stood frozen, breathing heavily. Jerry walked past her, pausing just for a moment. "Looks like you finally have some rules to follow," he said. Then he left, stepping outside, taking a deep breath. It wasn't over yet, but it was close. Over the next few days, things changed. The neighborhood felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. People who once stayed silent now whispered. Conversations happened in hushed tones. But Jerry could tell. The tide had turned. Karen's power was slipping, and she knew it. The once frequent letters and notices stopped. No more fake violations. No more threats. For the first time since this all started, Jerry wasn't waking up to another absurd fine taped to his door. He should have felt relief, but he knew Karen too well. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation, and he was right, because just when he thought it might be over, the final notice arrived, an official HOA announcement. Karen had been removed from the board, effective immediately. The petition had worked. The evidence had been enough. The board had no choice but to force her out. Jerry read the letter twice. Then again, it felt surreal, like it had happened too easily. But when he stepped outside, saw neighbors standing in small groups, talking, smiling, some even sending him nods of approval, he realized it hadn't been easy. It had just been necessary. He had done what no one else had dared to do. He had stood up to her, and he had won. Later that evening, he saw her, packing up her car, moving boxes stacked in her driveway. Her face hard, tight. She wasn't staying. Without her position, without her power, there was nothing left for her here. Jerry watched from his porch, beer in hand. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. She glanced at him once. Her eyes filled with rage. Then, without a word, she got into her car and drove away. For the first time in a long while, Jerry felt at peace. No more warnings. No more harassment. No more Karen. He sat on his porch, beer in hand, watching the sunset cast a golden glow over the neighborhood. It was quiet, calm, the way it had been before she arrived, the way it was always meant to be. The neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved. Some even stopped to chat, thanking him, telling him how they had been too afraid to speak up, how they had endured Karen's reign for too long. He just nodded. He hadn't done it for them. He had done it for himself. But if his fight had helped others, if it had freed the neighborhood from her grip, then maybe it had been worth it. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, enjoying the silence. He had won. And more importantly, He had his home back, his peace, his freedom. No HOA, no Karen, just him, and that was all he had ever wanted.